She is going to be just fine, sir.
Don't cry, Grandfather.
I'm just so glad you're safe.
Sir, she is going to be perfectly fine.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
The double doors of the emergency room burst open, and Rear Admiral Jonathan Whitfield stood frozen in the chaos, his hands clutching his own head as if trying to hold himself together, staring down at the one thing in this world he could not command, could not fix, could not save with 30 years of military discipline, his 7-year-old daughter, Grace, sitting silent on a gurney in a world without sound. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet miracles that happen in the most unexpected places, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's begin. Jonathan Whitfield had spent his career staring down the worst the world had to offer. He had led men through gunfire in places most Americans would never hear about, made decisions in seconds that meant life or death, and returned home each time with medals pinned to his chest and nightmares tucked behind his eyes. But nothing had prepared him for the day his daughter was born completely deaf. Grace came into the world quiet, in every sense. The doctors at the Naval Hospital in San Diego delivered the news gently, but there was no gentle way to tell a father that his little girl would never hear his voice, never hear music, never hear the ocean waves she would grow up beside. Jonathan's wife, Margaret, had passed away from complications during Grace's birth, leaving him to raise this silent, beautiful child alone while still serving his country. He had faced war. He had faced loss. But raising a deaf daughter as a single father, moving from base to base, missing recitals and school events for deployments, learning sign language in hotel rooms overseas with a battered instructional book, that was a different kind of battle, one fought in silence, one fought alone. For 7 years, Jonathan had built a world around Grace's silence. He learned American Sign Language until his fingers ached from practicing. He decorated her room with soft lights instead of alarms, taught her to feel vibrations through the floor when he came home, and made sure every teacher, every neighbor, every friend understood how to communicate with his little girl. He loved her fiercely, protectively, the way only a man who has lost everything else can love the one thing still standing. But deep in his chest, there was a wound that never closed, the ache of never having heard her laugh, never having heard her say "Daddy," never having shared with her the one thing every parent dreams of, the sound of their child's first spoken word. That afternoon, everything changed in an instant. Grace had been playing in the backyard of their home near the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, climbing the old oak tree Jonathan had built a small swing under. She lost her footing, fell hard, and struck her head against a root. A neighbor found her disoriented and rushed her to the hospital while frantically calling Jonathan's cell phone. By the time he arrived at the emergency room, still in his dress whites from a ceremony he'd been called away from, his heart was pounding harder than it ever had in combat. He rushed through those double doors, and there she was, small and fragile on a hospital bed, blood matted in her hair, her wide eyes searching the room for the only steady thing in her life. That was when Isabella Rodriguez walked in. Isabella was a trauma nurse, 29 years old, with 6 years of experience in some of the busiest emergency rooms on the East Coast. But before nursing, before the scrubs and the stethoscope, Isabella had spent for years as a combat medic in the United States Army, deployed twice overseas, where she had learned techniques far beyond anything taught in civilian nursing school, techniques for calming frightened patients, for communicating under chaos, for connecting with someone even when words failed completely. She had seen soldiers in shock, unable to speak, unable to process what was happening around them, and she had learned methods to reach them anyway, methods rooted not in sound, but in touch, rhythm, and presence. When Isabella approached Grace's bed, she noticed immediately the small hearing aids resting uselessly in the girl's ears, the panic in her eyes, and the way she flinched from every hand that reached toward her without warning. Most nurses would have proceeded with standard protocol, speaking loudly, gesturing vaguely, hoping the child would understand. But Isabella knelt down slowly, at eye level, and did something different. She placed her hand gently on Grace's shoulder first, a firm, grounding pressure she had learned to use with disoriented soldiers, a technique to signal presence and safety before any medical action began. Then, instead of speaking, she used slow, deliberate hand movements, a technique called tactile signing, pressing simple patterns into Grace's palm, a method she had learned while working with a blind and deaf veteran during her military service, someone who had taught her that connection did not require sound at all. Jonathan stood back, hands still trembling, watching this stranger communicate with his daughter in a way he hadn't seen before. Isabella traced gentle patterns onto Grace's hand, patterns that meant safe, patterns that meant brave, patterns that meant I am here. Slowly, the panicking Grace's small body began to ease. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. For the first time since the fall, she looked less like a frightened animal and more like a little girl who understood that someone in this loud, terrifying room actually saw her. As Isabella continued examining Grace for signs of concussion, checking her pupils, gently probing for further injury, she noticed something on the medical chart that made her pause. Under hearing status, it noted profound bilateral hearing loss since birth, but beneath that, scrawled by an audiologist months earlier, was a note Jonathan himself had almost forgotten about: candidate for cochlear implant evaluation, pending further testing. Isabella looked up at Jonathan, her eyes sharp with a question that carried more weight than she perhaps realized. She asked him directly whether Grace had ever been formally evaluated for implants beyond that single note, because in her time overseas, she had worked alongside a military audiology unit that specialized in exactly these kinds of complex pediatric cases, and something about Grace's chart told her this note had never been followed up on. Jonathan admitted, voice breaking slightly, that between deployments, moving duty stations 3 times in 4 years, and simply trying to survive as a single father, he had never had the chance to pursue it further. The guilt in his face was unmistakable. A man who could organize military operations across continents, who could deploy hundreds of men into hostile territory with precision, had somehow let this one thing slip through the cracks of his own exhausted, grieving life. Isabella did not judge him. Instead, she made a decision that would change everything. She told him about a program she had personal connections to, run through a partnership between the Naval Medical Center and a renowned pediatric hearing institute in Bethesda, Maryland, a program that fast-tracked evaluations for military families precisely because so many, like Jonathan, fell through administrative cracks due to deployments and relocations. She picked up the phone that very evening, after her shift ended, and made calls using contacts she had built during her years as a combat medic, connections that existed outside normal referral systems, favors owed among people who had served together in dangerous places and never forgotten it. 3 weeks later, Grace underwent a full evaluation. The results were extraordinary. She was, in fact, an excellent candidate for bilateral cochlear implants, her auditory nerve fully intact, simply waiting, all these years, for a chance no one had given her. The surgery was scheduled for the following month, at no small cost, but the Naval Medical Center covered it entirely as an active duty dependent, something Jonathan hadn't fully understood he was even eligible for. The day of Grace's activation, the day the implants would be turned on for the very first time, Jonathan stood in a small audiology room in Bethesda with his hands clenched at his sides, the same way they had been clenched in that emergency room weeks earlier, except this time it wasn't panic holding him together. It was hope. Isabella, who had taken personal leave to be there, stood beside him, having become far more than a nurse to this family over the past month. She had become, in some unspoken way, the bridge between Jonathan's silent grief and the future he hadn't dared imagine. The audiologist activated the processor, and for a moment, nothing happened. Grace sat still, blinking, adjusting to sensations she had never known. Then, slowly, her eyes widened. She turned her head toward the sound of the air conditioning humming in the room, something she had never registered before. She turned toward the audiologist's voice. And then, achingly, beautifully, she turned toward her father, who had knelt down instinctively, tears already streaming down his weathered face, and said the word he had practiced signing to her 1,000 times but had never once heard her speak aloud, Daddy. Jonathan Whitfield, a man who had survived firefights, who had carried wounded men on his back through enemy territory, who had buried his wife and raised a daughter alone in silence, collapsed to his knees in that small room and wept like he had never allowed himself to weep before. Grace, startled by the sound of her own voice for the first time in her life, reached out and touched his face, feeling the vibration of his sobs, hearing, for the very first time, the sound of her father's love. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it made you believe just a bit more in the power of kindness shown by strangers, in the quiet heroism of people like Isabella who use what they've learned to change lives when no one is watching, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need this today. Before we go, I want to ask you something. Comment below the word you would want to hear first if you had never heard a sound in your life. I read every single one, and I promise you, some of your answers will break my heart in the best way. Grace Whitfield grew up in a house that was no longer silent. She learned to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, her father beside her every step of the way, relearning the world alongside her, hearing birds and rainfall and her own daughter's laughter for the very first time, together. Isabella remained close to the family for years afterward, a guest at birthday parties, a familiar face at school recitals, the woman who Grace would later say, in a voice she was never supposed to have, saved her life not with a scalpel, but with a hand held gently in the dark, and the simple, unshakable belief that everyone deserves to be heard.